And Stephanie, welcome everyone to the 400 years timeline of our diversity session series with Danielle Johnson. If you can please take a moment to look in the chat. I'm going to ask my colleague Stephanie to put the sign in. So if you could fill that out, just a couple questions so that we know you're here. And thank you so much for spending your Thursday evening with us. And if you're just joining us, if you can please look to the chat. My colleague Stephanie is going to be putting the sign in. And if you can just take a moment to fill that out so that we know you're here. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Also, if you would like to hear this presentation in Spanish, please go to the bottom of your screen, hit the globe and choose Spanish. And we have our translator, Carmen, translating for us. So if you have any questions, she's here to help assist. And Danielle, if we want to maybe give it 2 more minutes till 5:05 to get started. Again, if you're just joining us, please look to the chat to fill in the sign-in sheet. My colleague Stephanie just put it into the chat. Also, if you would like to hear this presentation in Spanish, please go to the bottom of your screen, hit the globe, and choose Spanish. And our translator, Carmen, is here to assist if you do have any questions on the translation. And thank you for joining us. And we're going to get started at 5:05. So. Welcome everyone to the 400 years timeline with our speaker, Danielle Johnson. If you haven't already, if you could please check the chat and fill in the sign-in sheet so we know that you're here. And if you would like to hear this presentation in Spanish, please go to the bottom of your screen, click the globe and choose Spanish. And if you have any questions, Carmen is on hand to be our translator. And I think I'm gonna turn it over to Danielle.
All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Please let me know if you have any problems hearing me or if there's any problem seeing my PowerPoint, but we will jump right in. So thank you again for the invite and being a part of the kickoff of this diversity series. I'm very excited to engage. And I want to make sure that I give you all a little bit of background. My name is Danielle Johnson, and I'm serving as your conversation catalyst this evening here in Wichita, Kansas, where I'm born and raised, right in the middle of the United States. We have an organization called the Kansas Leadership Center. And in that space, we have a gentleman by the name of Ed O'Malley. He serves as the CEO there. And he really likes to utilize the term conversation catalyst. And I was affectionately dubbed, among some other folks, someone that is a conversational catalyst. A catalyst is an event or person that causes great change. And I believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion there's an opportunity for us to be catalysts for change in that space. While not always comfortable, it's oftentimes needed. So I'm your conversation catalyst for this evening. In my professional realm, my day-to-day job, I serve as the executive director to Wichita Habitat for Humanity, where we really lean into affordable housing and working alongside folks to ensure that they get into a decent place to live. So that's something that's really important to Wichita Habitat. Habitat's been in the Wichita community for about 35 years as of last year. So excited to be in that space. I share that because it ties into some of this work. We'll talk a little bit about redlining this evening when we talk about history and historical events. So we will move right along. I do have some engagement guidelines. My hope is that you all are prepared to have some conversations. This is a reflective, conversational type of workshop. So please be prepared to engage. I understand that it's the evening time and you all might have a million things to do, particularly if you're a caregiver, might be getting settled from getting off of work and having to get dinner started and all those fun, fine things. But I ask that in the moments where you can engage, that you are prepared to do so. And when we do that, there are some guidelines that I would like for you all to have for your consideration. And please feel free to share these guidelines because the work continues after our conversation this evening, right? We are going to be energized, we're going to engage and discuss, but it does us no good for this hour and a half that we have if you all don't continue to do the work outside of this space. So I invite you all to continue the dialogue in your circles and your homes. So as a conversation catalyst, I reserve the right to halt the dialogue for productive engagement. I have not had to use that, so I'm sure we'll continue to engage respectfully. And if all else fails, agree to disagree. We're going to try to work at listening without bias. We all have bias. That is an innate quality of ours in our brains. And if you tune in, I think I have implicit bias somewhere in the series, so we'll get more in depth than that. But just a brief overview at this point, I want you to really listen and engage. And if you find yourself getting some tension or getting some irritation, lean into that and dig into, why am I reacting this way? Or why is this maybe making me upset? Or why is this making me incredibly happy? Why am I so excited, right? Understand the emotion that you're portraying in this space and really work to listen without bias. Challenge yourself to understand others' perspectives. We have an opportunity to really listen and learn about our own backgrounds this evening. My hope is that you all will be vulnerable in the space and share your walks. And in doing so, we want to make sure that we work to understand the perspective of those on the screen with us this evening. Embrace being reflective. There may be points where I ask some questions that are rhetorical, right? I don't need a response so much as, how is this showing up for you? How does this timeline show up for you, your family, your culture, your local, regional, national history? So this is an opportunity for you to really think about your time, place, and space with the work that we'll be doing this evening. Park the car, one of my personal favorites. I don't expect folks to use the same language that I use, right? We might have some cultural commonalities on the screen this evening, but we're certainly not all the same. And so I ask that you state your question, say your answers, and just be open to utilizing this space as a learning space. Be open to education, learning from one another. Be open to correction, but we're going to correct with love. We're going to call in and not call out. So let's please be open in this space to be able to make some mistakes, but also be able to educate one another as well in making those mistakes. Freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence. So you still may offend, that happens, right? An apology goes a long way, a sincere one anyway, and a willingness to educate yourself after the apology really helps to solidify our rapport this evening. So let's, again, just be open to the conversations that we'll be able to have. Double confidentiality, which is another one that's important to me. I don't know how many folks know each other on the screen. My assumption is some folks work with each other and some folks don't know anyone from Adam or Eve. So with that being said, I want you all to ensure that you're not sharing anyone's stories out of this space. And if you do know someone on the screen, that you don't walk up to them afterwards and say, hey, Sylvia, I didn't know that about you. Tell me more, right? Sometimes we want the juiciness of the story when we're really listening for the principles of the story. So let's respect everyone's confidentiality, listen to the successes and the missteps, take those principles out of the story, but not let these stories walk out of this space as gossip, right? Stories stay, lessons leave. Continue the dialogue with others. And lastly, we're going to lean into discomfort with grace. We want to be gracious with each other this evening, especially as we talk about history. There's a lot of things going on across our country, and it feels like teaching history is even under attack. I don't understand everyone's political background, but I want us to be mindful that I know in my legislature in Kansas, they're saying critical race theory and teaching certain things in K through 12 should not be allowed. And I take issue with that because I believe in teaching and educating our kids holistically, and that the United States boasts a very cultural group of folks, right? All of which don't necessarily come from the country that we're sitting in. So I'm going to say some uncomfortable things. I hope I get invited back, but I want you all to ensure that we understand what the political landscape looks like us for our cities and our states, and the attack on public education and those sitting in those spaces trying to do the best that they can. That being said, is there anything else you all would like to add to make this conversation a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more robust? Any engagement guidelines that you all like to utilize? Okay. If none, we will move forward. Again, please feel free to use what you see, and I will use whatever you all decide to share as well for future engagements. As we go into the 400 years timeline, I really want us to center our lens. And what I mean by that is when we conversate, when we engage with one another, please take the time to utilize these 4 specific points as you synthesize and go through this work. So remember those that struggled, strived, and thrived for the path to liberation. Remember our collective humanity. Respect the legacy of our elders. Listen to and respect the telling of stories. Respect that everyone has a story to tell. Learn more about our history. Learn to tell your own story. And lastly, reconnect to the place you live, connect with others that share stories, and together we are the history of a just future. But we can only be a collective of a just future if we understand our roots and where we came from, and particularly if we have the privilege to understand our roots and where we came from, because not everyone can go back in their line and their lineage and understand where they came from. So if you have access to that information or family or culture, I would say lean into that while you still have the opportunity to do so, because not everyone has that privilege. So be keeping those pieces in your lens as we work through the 400 years timeline. And just a little bit about the timeline. It follows the history of African Americans, women, Native Indigenous people, and working class people across racial and ethnic bounds. So those are the 4 groups that this timeline really focuses in on. It's about 400 years spanning from 1619 to 2019. So my hope is you all have had a time to look at it, but we will give some time for you all to also look at it on your own. I know Tracy has done a great job of sharing and resharing and sharing and resharing again. So I'm certain you all have the information in front of you. So feel free to take some time to have that kind of in the background if you need to be able to refer back to. And this timeline was really brought together by research students in a 400 years of inequality class at the New School taught by Mindy Fullilove. And this was in the fall and spring of 2017. So strong group of folks really worked hard on this work. And you can actually type in 400 years timeline. There's a bunch of free resources and website information for you all to utilize if you want to continue to endeavor in this work. If we were in person, I would actually have 2 large timelines on the floor, and we would have small groups of folks actually spend time and interact with the timeline. You would walk around the timeline. There would be some reflection activities. This is going to look a little bit different, but there are opportunities for that. So, and you all could actually access that timeline and print it off and do some collective work within your own communities as well. There was a bigger splash of this when it rolled out in 2019. And my hope is that there's another timeline that comes out and that they continue to update and provide the work around the timeline itself, as we have a very vast history. So mindfulness, how many of you all are in tune with mindfulness activities or meditate, any of those things? We have folks that do any of that. Okay, see some head nods and some hand raising. I'm still really leaning into that journey and understanding the importance of mindfulness and how being intentional, understanding your breath, being grounded to your community, being grounded to your land, how important that is. And so in this moment, I would just ask that you all take a few deep breaths, get as comfortable as you possibly can. really center and focus your mind in this time frame. I'm not gonna, I debated on whether or not we should do a full breathing activity, but I was like, we'll we will just be in the space as best as we can, and everyone just kind of follow their own breath. If you feel any tension in your body, let those things go as we kind of go through, but pay attention to your emotional state as we're reflective, because that's going to read a lot to you as well as we're talking about this history. And feel free to share those things. So I ask again that we're present. If you have multiple screens up, I ask that you minimize those, right? We're deciding to take an evening to learn D&I. So let's really lean into that and give it the time that it needs to really learn from one another. And then I urge you to continue on a mindfulness meditation journey, right? If you're someone that really likes to do things via apps, there's Calm, there's Relax, there's all types of things for you to consider. But sometimes it's really just about finding the most quiet space, grounding yourself, and really just paying attention to that breath at the most easiest, most elementary way of doing it. And then I'm sure there's some gurus on the screen that could probably give you a little bit more in-depth conversation about it, but we're here to talk about the 400-year timeline. And then the last thing I will ask in this pretty in-depth intro is that if you have the ability or opportunity to be on the screen with us, I invite you to be on screen. I know not everyone has the ability to do that, but if you do have the ability to be on screen so that we can have a little bit more of that intimate feel with one another, I invite you all to join us on the screen as you can and as you comfortably can. All right, so we're gonna engage here for a moment. We'll go out into some breakout rooms, and in your breakout rooms, you're going to have just some brief discussion and some questions I want you all to be thinking about. Is knowing your history important to you? Second, were you someone that learned history to pass the test, or someone who truly enjoyed and retained history lessons? So were you just studying it because it was due? I need to know the test. I took AP history. I need to know all the answers. Or did you really take the time to enjoy, retain, understand the history that you were taught? And then lastly, have you experienced any barriers or obstacles to learning in your cultural familial space? Were there any barriers to learning? So those are the questions that you all are going to engage in. And I would ask that as many folks take the time to share, right? You'll probably have about 5 or 6 folks in your room. But in those spaces, please round robin. We don't need any specific facilitator, but I ask because we will do a lot of engagement for you all to share. Is knowing your history important to you? How did you learn it? Was it pass the test, or I really engaged? Or did you have barriers or obstacles to learning your history, maybe culturally or your familiar history? And we can go into those breakout rooms.
Okay, here we go. Happy talking. And Diana, I think you came a little late, so let me put you into a room. And let's see. Diana, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. I'm just trying to see how I can put, oh, here you are. So let me put you, you're going to go into room 3. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem at all.
Sorry, we had someone finishing up. I did hear you though. So it always happens you get sucked out of the room.
And Danielle, just a friendly reminder, if we're coming back from a breakout room, please make sure that you recheck your language if you're wanting Spanish. I think it gets knocked off in the breakout rooms.
Thank you for that. Okay. So actually, if I can hear from a couple of folks, how were those questions? And hopefully the groups are engaging. It gets kind of awkward when you're the only one sitting there. So, and we will have more of these. So this was a warm up. Please be prepared to engage because we will do it again.
We didn't have enough time, Danielle.
Okay.
It was just getting good
Yeah,
in our group. And then we got whiplash coming back over here. We were
Well,
trying to get it on, and it was great just talking
okay.
to the ladies and hearing their background stories and their love for where history came into being important on their own as they began to investigate. And some families didn't talk about certain things, others shared phenomenal historical stories that I thought were extremely interesting, especially one of the great grandmothers, Dana's great grandmother or something. What was it, a part of Pancho Villa, or who was it?
Wow.
Great grandmother, my great grandmother.
Monica, great grandma. Yeah, we were getting into some good stuff, but it was awesome. It was good. It was good. The love of history came from searching out and knowing and wanting to, um, get more involved, get more information. But it did not come through school. A lot of it didn't come from school. It came from, outside learning and families.
Okay. Thank you. Who else? What did other groups talk about?
Fran, Jose, or Eric, come on, one of you guys speak up.
Oh, I thought you was going to cover it down for us.
I led the conversation.
All right. Okay, great. I'll share. I was telling her not as important initially, but as I came more aware of who I was and wanted to really have an understanding who I was, and knowing that the history books didn't reflect me as an African-American man, and doing research on my own, it became more important. I think one of the things I talked about is representation. The reason it wasn't important to me was representation, right? So the history books had, the basic things for African-American to understand their history, the same people, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, and the basics, talking about slavery, talking about segregation, but it didn't really go into detail about all the impact that African Americans had in this country, which were huge. And I'm sure it's the same thing with Asian Americans and everything. We all had a piece of making this country great, but and when it's the old adage: sometimes if you don't see someone that looks like you, sometimes that's impactful, and you want to aspire to things. And when you don't see people, you're like, okay, what is it what we bring to the table in this country when you're not really reflecting it as a whole in our history? So my thing was initially not as much interest to me, but later on when I started to want to know, I know we've made more impact in this. I know other Americans have made more impact in this. It became very important to me.
Yes.
So that's all I said.
Thank you.
So, if I can just jump in a little bit. I myself, I was always told that I was a Mexican, which I am, okay? But then everybody would ask me about my last name, because I don't know if you all know my last name. It's Sarah Saracen. It's spelled Sereses. And I didn't realize that I'm a full-fledged American. I was born in America, so I'm full-fledged American, and I have Hispanic background. But my family and my great-grandparents, the name comes, I'm French and Spanish, which was a surprise to me, but I didn't find that out till I was already out of high school. But I just want to share that with you.
If I can add a little bit to that part of the story too, as an immigrant, as I was sharing it with my group, I didn't come from Mexico. I came from South America. I came from Ecuador. And the history books, nothing, and not even in college, ever talked about my history from my own country. And so when I came to this country, I was 10 years old. And so it wasn't by choice that I came, it's because of a necessity that I came. And so throughout most of my adult life, I have not, studied my own history from my own country in school, at least in a formal setting. I've done it through my family, through just different readings and things like that. So, and I've always felt that, that I needed to sort of forget about my own history from my own country, because I was in this country. And the expectation was you have to learn the history from this country, since you're sort of in someone else's country, in another house, somebody else's house. So therefore, I grew up with that type of mentality.
Thank you for that. And I really appreciate the engagement that happened in these other groups. I'm like, oh, I need to just bounce around and listen to all the conversations. So thank
Oh
you.
yeah,
For
we laid it down in our group. We laid it down.
Okay, well, you'll have another opportunity to share more. So let me go ahead and get my screen together. So we're going to do an activity called the Shoulders of Giants. And this is going to provide an opportunity for you to share a little bit more about your background, your history, and the people that got you to where you are today.
Oh, wow.
So when we think about the shoulders that we stand on, the people that have lifted us up, some questions for you to think about. And if you have the little handout, the workbook handout, you can also type. It is a fillable PDF that you would have received, or if you just want to jot down some notes for yourself. It doesn't have to be eloquent by any means, but just some questions to jog your thought process. When I think back on my life, who has lifted me up? Who has made sacrifices for me to be where I am today? Who has mentored me? Who has modeled the way? Where do I draw my strength, persistence, goal seeking from? Whose shoulders do I stand on? So be thinking and reflective of this particular question. And I'll share a little bit of my background because I think it's important that while I'm at the front of the room, if you will, or on the Zoom screen amongst you all, that you have an opportunity to learn about my background as well. So I stand on the shoulders of Marta and Larry Andrews, a mother who is from Pampanga, Philippines, a woman who cleaned hotels and worked in various manufacturing companies, who pushed me to achieve my education. My father hails from Birmingham, Alabama. He taught me my roots in history before the school system did. They both poured into me servant leadership, love for community, reaching my goals, and an affinity to celebrate. I love some Filipino food and some soul food. Those things together make my heart sing, right? So being able to understand that, having spent time in Birmingham, Alabama, a couple of summers, my dad made it very clear I understood what happened in my line, in my lineage, for me culturally. My mom too made sure I understood. When we think about the farming movement, the farming migrant movement, it wasn't just Mexican Americans or just Hispanics that worked in that space. It was Filipinos as well. And I didn't always know or understand that. But it's important to understand the totality of a story that we tell in our history books, who all helped to really make this country great. And they look like everyone on this screen. So my hope is that as we continue to share our backgrounds, whether we're from this country or others, that we share a little bit about our roots and who we are, so that we can have an understanding of each other's history and then talk about our country's larger history. So this is going to be a little bit of a longer breakout, so folks can share a little bit more about themselves. I think this one is an 8-10 minute. So be prepared to share. Again, it doesn't have to be poetic by any means, to share a little bit. And we will go into the breakout rooms now.
Okay, here we go.
We need more time.
All right. Looks like everybody got pulled out. So if we can hear from just a couple of folks, what was shared? The floor is open.
Who wants to share? All right, come on, somebody from my group. Come on, Zelma. Where you at, Zelma? Monica. Somebody share.
Who are the shoulders that you all stand on?
I can share an observation that I made as we were talking. There's a lot of women's shoulders that we all stood on, male and female, like, so
Yeah.
that was a lot of the people in our group had different women in their lives who shoulders that they stood on.
Yes.
Happy Women's History Month.
Yes.
I agree. I'll just add to that. It was, the impactful one for me was my mom. I mean, most of the impact of my life growing up were women. So You know, my dad was not engaged with me as I was growing up. Most of the people that made the most impact were the most insightful on me and my drive were women. So, and my mom being that strong strength internally for me.
Thank you. Got some strong shoulders around here.
Yep.
Gotta be. You know, it was interesting. A couple of us said the same women, like Maya Angelou, Michelle Obama, who I have a collection of purses by. But anyway, but that's a side story. But it was really interesting to recognize, again, those that made the greatest impact and whose shoulders we stood on, we recognized were some women who laid some foundational things. Our grandmothers, our mothers, our women from history that we still stand on, and that even mentored us. Even though they didn't know they mentored us, they mentored us. So that was some of the observations that we came back with.
Thank you. Right, I do this activity because it's important for us to be connected. It's important to be connected to your own history, right? It's important for us to understand where we're coming from so that we can understand the collective history. So I just want to be able to throw that out there and take some time to have us reminisce. I saw a couple of folks and some strong head nods. Fran, did you want to jump in and say anything?
Oh, I just kind of thinking about what we're talking about is that, and what I've been experiencing and I've been thinking a lot about is our young people, what they're going through. And a lot of our young people, they don't have the strength at home, like most of us have shared tonight, at home, teaching them the different ground rules of life. Excuse me. And I feel that I think somehow, some way, we can do something, and it has to start at home, of course, but I don't know, this is something that's been on me, and I've been trying to think of how I can get involved and get some of these parents to and I know it's hard because a lot of the parents both have to work, and life is really hard for most of them because they have other children. Somehow I don't even know how they make it, because the way we are living now, everything is so expensive. But I just feel that we have to spend more time teaching our young people that home is not only a place that you live. There's got to come more love has to come out of the home somewhere, somehow. And that has to be taught, and it should be taught at school. Really, the teacher should teach them. Love your parents. Do what you can for your parents, keep bringing that up always, especially when they're young, because they don't realize even when they're little, they like their mom and their dad, but they don't realize a lot of things. But if you keep talking to them and telling them, eventually we might not have so many children that are going astray right now. So anyway, I better thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to share my screen again, just so you all can see it. Well, I'm saying I'm going to share my screen. Sorry. I'm going to share a quick video clip. Again, just wanting to be able to showcase some of my local history for you all. Like I shared, I come from Wichita, Kansas. And so I'm going to share a quick video clip with you all and go into some general history. And it centers on some redlining as we go a little bit further. And then we'll get right back into the timeline itself. So can everybody see the screen? Unfortunately, this does not let me turn on closed captioning. So I want to apologize in advance if that is not very accessible. But this clip is important to where we're going. So I apologize in advance that there is no closed captioning for the video.
While Dr. King led the climb to the civil rights mountaintop, there were others on the journey, including some who started a sit-in, not in the Deep South, but in the Kansas heartland. Jim Axelrod met them.
If the sculptures in downtown Wichita are designed to salute a certain pioneering spirit, then look no further than this bronze soda fountain.
Were you thinking to yourselves, hey, we're going to make history here?
No, we were thinking we were going to sit until we were served.
54 years ago this July, Carol Parks Hahn led a group of 30 students from the local NAACP into Dockham's drugstore, where they could get food to go, but not eat at the counter.
I simply went in and I sat down, and the waitress behind the counter came up to me, and she took my order, actually. And she leaned forward, and she said, "You're not colored, are you, dear?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And the lunch counter was around about here, wasn't it, Galen?
We brought Parks Hahn back to what's left of Dockham's, along with fellow participant Galen Vesey, who was 21 at the time and haunted by the hatred of the civil rights movement.
Were you feeling, while this was going on, that you were in the process of making history?
Oh, I don't think at the moment you had time to capture that, because looming not far away was Little Rock, the Montgomery bus boycotts.
You were more concerned about your safety.
Certainly, that was part of it.
Every day they took shifts at the counter, 2 to 3 hours at a time. There was no violence, but the white customers took their business elsewhere. Finally, after 3 weeks, the Dockhams desegregated the counters at all 9 of their stores. This was 18 months before 4 students sat down at the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina. But it's that counter that's in the Smithsonian.
The story of what happened here challenges an assumption about racism in this country, that it was limited just to the South. Is that?
No. Some were aware of it and some were not, that Kansas or Wichita was this way.
Kansas and a lot of other places until these students came along.
We wanted to be able to go in and sit down and have a hamburger and a Coke. You know, we couldn't do that.
Just being able to get a hamburger and a Coke. It
sounds simple, doesn't it?
Sometimes simple ideas are the most powerful, like standing up by sitting in. Jim Axelrod, CBS News, Wichita, Kansas.
So I share that little bit of history because in the history books, when I was growing up, I was taught in my own city that the first sit-in wasn't here. So being able to share that, and then right down the street, Oklahoma City has a sit-in that was very early as well, about a week after the end of the sit-in that happened in Wichita. And then you go into Greensboro, North Carolina. So understanding what happened, understanding about the Tulsa race riots. Many folks didn't know about that till some hit show came on HBO. And people in the city of Tulsa was there not too long ago and had an opportunity to talk to folks. They themselves didn't even know. Their newspaper went a long way to hide and erase articles and pull articles out of circulation to hide the truth. And I mentioned the Tulsa massacre, but you know how many massacres happened across the country in booming communities and cities? And it didn't just happen to Black folks, it happened to Native Indigenous folks, right? Because those were the first peoples to experience that type of terrorism. And I dub it terrorism because that's what it was called. That's what it is. We don't always call it terrorism, but there were terrorist acts in our country on many of our communities, our Black and brown Indigenous folk, right? Our lower socioeconomic status white people, right? We all have the opportunity to experience discrimination. We all have the opportunity to experience privilege as well. And I want us to really kind of understand that it's a both and in these spaces. So understanding your local history is important. Some other kind of things, food for thought for you all as we think about our history and inequality. And we talk about affordable housing today. Why is it that some folks can't afford housing or get into those spaces? Well, when we think about the GI Bill, and we think about the wealth gap that really was created more in that space. I'm going to read this word for word. The Burnetts were the only Black Americans for whom the promise of the GI Bill turned out to be an illusion. Though the bill helped white Americans prosper and accumulate wealth in the post-war years, it didn't deliver on the promise for veterans of color. In fact, the wide disparity in the bill's implementation ended up helping drive growing gaps in wealth, education, and civil rights between white and Black Americans. While the GI Bill's language did not specifically exclude African-American veterans from its benefits, it was structured in a way that ultimately shut down or shut doors for about 1.2 million Black veterans who had bravely served their country during World War II in segregated ranks. And when you think about that number and then think about generation after generation after generation not being able to get into the housing market, not being able to get the promise of, we're gonna pay for this house, right? I've served my country, but I didn't get all the spoils that I was deserved to be able to serve this country. And when we think about redlining, neighborhoods with, and a little bit about redlining, neighborhoods with minority occupants were marked in red and considered risk from mortgage lenders. Redlining was carried out by government, banks, realtors, appraisers, entities who worked in tangent to ensure Black and brown people did not have access to homes and wealth. Segregationist policies like school funding, which is based on property tax values, are impeding the process. And when we talk about our public schools, well, those dollars come from tax dollars, right? And so when those tax dollars aren't being generated for your school system, you can't make those improvements. So when we think about our redlining maps, there's all types of disparities that are connected to those maps. American public schools are divided along economic and racial lines. A recent study showed that predominantly non-white school districts received $23 billion less funding. And this is a little bit of an older statistic. I know it's grown since then, than their white counterpart districts. The drawing of school districts is rooted in real estate redlining, a form of lending discrimination, right? When we think about, look at your school districts, look at those lines, look at how they're drawn. Consequently, look at your voting lines. Look at how those are drawn, right? Look at your school boards, look at your representation. And you can see those historical things popping up and bubbling up for us today, but it all is rooted in systemic historical issues. Systemic inequities in education have come into clear focus as our nation splinters over a global pandemic and racial reckoning, right? And while we're trying to come out of the pandemic, we're still very much there, and that exacerbated the depths of inequality. I think we saw it even more over the last 2 years. So nearly 51 million students are enrolled in American public schools, but we see that the system is not providing an equitable education. But that comes from somewhere. So this is Wichita. This was our redlining map. And do you see how much is redlined? That's a large portion of our city. D2, this large area contains, and this actually comes, these are remarks from the raters. This large area contains the Negro concentration of Wichita. In the north end, immediately south of the Packing House and Stockyards district, are a number of Mexicans. Property in this area is poor, shaky, and typical of Negro properties. Right? This is what officially was written down. You can actually go and look in you all's information and find what was written in your cities and communities, right? The documentation is there for you to get a better understanding, but what was considered hazardous were the people that made up the space, right? Sometimes when you think, oh, this is a hazardous area, we're not talking about the chemicals in the ground. We're talking about the people were considered hazardous. The 1930s, minorities made up 12% of Wichita's population, but only received 2% of home loans. Wichita was the third most redlined city in the United States. My home, where I come from. So when we think about those disparities, and this is as of the Washington Post, those disparities today still exist. So if you look at your cities and you look at the redlined areas and you look at the social determinants of health, those will be the same areas that have your highest levels of obesity. Those will be your same communities that are low socioeconomic status, have little to no access. Those will probably be the same areas that are your food deserts, right? I like to call it food apartheid because it's systemic, right? There's a reason why you can't get to your store, but it's not your fault, right? So these systems are passed down, and we have to understand where we come from when we're talking about policies and procedures so that we can ensure that we're being educated about what has happened within our own communities and why we have a lack of access. So you all have an opportunity to really dive deep into your timeline. There's no shortage of information there. And I want you all to be able to spend some time with the timeline. And maybe we carve out about 5 minutes for you really just to pull it up, look at your timeline, and be prepared to discuss some items that stood out to you on that timeline. And really the timeline is meant for you to spend a little bit more intimate time, but we'll spend the last 30 minutes just really diving in and conversating about some things that, you know, what did we miss? What did we not realize was going on in our own history? And how does that parallel to what we were taught? You know, earlier I asked in our initial breakout, when we think about history, how did we receive it? How did we understand it? And many folks said, well, you know, I studied for the test, or I really didn't, I mean, it wasn't necessarily an interest. And I can say the same. Like, I learned it. And then my dad was always on my head about, you need to know your history. You need to know this. Don't let them teach you this. Don't let them teach you that. Understand it, right? So I was blessed to have that opportunity to share. Hold on, I'm going to pull this up. But even as much as I was able to be taught and engage with, it certainly wasn't this extensive. And then I had the privilege to go to a university and get a little bit more in depth. But when you look at this timeline, you just realize, wow, there were so many things going on, and how inaccurate we were taught, and the rose-colored glasses that were put on our eyes to talk about it, right? From Thanksgiving to Columbus Day, we're taught some very specific things. And then when you go back and you look and you spend time, and then you get proximate to the communities, when you get to know your Native Indigenous brothers and sisters, when you get to know your underrepresented people, you start to realize, no, they probably didn't want to be conquered. Right? When we think about colonialism, when we think about all of those things and how it shows up today, we can never fix our mouth to say how lazy X group is, because that's certainly not true. Even down to something that stood out to me, as I love watching documentaries, but the breastfeeding of children. And when we think about during the slave times, how many Black women were breastfeeding children that were not their own. And then when we think about our Black and brown communities and how many women don't even want to breastfeed today, or don't understand, or can't, right? There's some women that can't breastfeed, but just the stigma sometimes that's around breastfeeding, we're trying to reclaim it. But at one point in time, many of us we were truly the nurturer. So to be called lazy or labeled lazy, right? Our Latinx Hispanic communities, who oftentimes are working jobs that no one else wants to work, yet we're telling them, you're taking our jobs. No one's lining up for the meatpacking plant jobs here in Kansas. I promise you they're not. Right? So just having those educated conversations that people are working incredibly hard day in and day out. So how do we talk about this? How do we fix our language to say, what opportunities are we providing to everyone to have access? What are the access points for everyone, regardless of racial and ethnic background? But equity says that we take some of those things into account. Who needs a little bit more help? So if you come from a community like mine, it's definitely about the bootstraps. But some folks don't have boots and some folks don't have straps. So what do you do then, right? If there's no boots and no straps, I have to walk around barefoot and still make it work. So that's something for us to consider as we go into our dialogue. But what are some things that stood out to you when you looked at this timeline that was just like, I didn't realize that was there. I didn't realize that was a part. And there are 2 PDFs like I shared, but take some time to just focus. And I know I've talked a little bit to give you all some time to really look over what you have. And again, it's really more of a reflective activity as you continue to move on, but we will go into some breakout rooms. Let me get my screen shared again. So some questions that you'll go into in your breakout room. You're going to highlight 2 or 3 events that stood out to you. And again, there's 2 sheets, so anyone in the timelines. How that timeline make you feel is one of the questions. How does this show up in the history you were taught? So think about your educational setting, be it homeschool, private school, public school, whatever setting that was. How were some of these things taught to you? Recall that. Your family, whoever you call family, right? Whoever those folks were that you spent the most time with growing up, how did they talk about these events? And maybe share, if they didn't, say that, we didn't talk about history. That wasn't something that was important to us. And then culturally, when you think about how you identify your racial and ethnic background, your nation of origin, how does some of this history show up in your line, your lineage? And then what major events are missing? Again, it goes from 1619 to 2019. So there won't be anything after 2019. But I'm sure if we extended it, there would be no shortage of events that could be added. And we would see some probably duplication in those events, which is unfortunate. So we're gonna put you all now into the breakout rooms. This is the focus. And we will.
Okay, I'm gonna put everybody into breakout rooms, and bon voyage and happy conversations.
All right.
Danielle,
Yes.
I ran and got my book that I just ordered, and I'm gonna share it with you. I just ordered it for my grandkids. It's called Timelines from Black History, Leaders, Legends, and Legacies. And when I got it, it has a lot of your timeline, and it goes all the way back, all the way back. And after I started reading it, I decided to keep it for myself, and I'm gonna give my grandkids something.
Well, when you're done, pass it down, pass it down. I know we're dwindling on time, so if I can hear maybe from 2 folks that might want to share. 2 folks and what you shared. We'll be brief. Go ahead. Were folks aware of the history already? Did folks feel like they had a good grasp on? Sorry, I was just talking this whole time. I did this last time, so you would think. So
No, that was me, Danielle. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Okay. I was like, did you miss everything I just said?
No, we heard you.
Okay. Were you all aware of the history in front of you? Did you all feel like you had a good grasp on it?
In our group, there was some things that like kind of stood out that, we did kind of learn, but it was still that like, there's so much. And even like the ones that we did learn, when we learned them and how we came to come across that information, it was, did it feel good because it wasn't through schools. It wasn't through, the education system. It was through other means. And yeah, it felt like it's all a lie. Oh, big lie.
Right.
But if I can step in, the question is, were you aware of the history? And to be truly honest with you, not really, until I started to listen to all of you speaking tonight, how much I've learned just from this little time that we spent together, and how much I have really missed as far as the growth of our country and the growth of each individual, no matter where you come from. So I learned quite a bit in the last hour. I think I've learned to appreciate life, and I do appreciate life, I'll tell you. I may be in a wheelchair, but that doesn't stop me. And I have learned from all of you your different shortcomings and your different, what you appreciate in life and what you bring to the table. And I thank you very much for enlightening my life. Thank you. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. Right. And the timeline is not about guilt, blame, or shame. History is not about guilt, blame, or shame. Right. If we could get past the guilt, blame, and shame piece, we could really take some time to really learn and educate and try not to repeat some of those same things. Right. We kind of treat history like the hot potato. Well, it was your fault.
And enjoy life.
Right. So it's important for us to look at history for what it is, understand the truth behind it. There's some truths there. There's some things that we cannot deny that have happened in our country. And the quicker we understand that, the quicker we can get to a place of reciprocity and understanding, right? And we can understand what some of those next steps are. So my hope is that you all continue to spend time with the timeline. Again, this is just a reflective workshop so that you can spend some time kind of learning and looking at that history. And as we wrap up, I love to share the Maya Angelou, someone whose shoulders I believe I stand on while not having had an opportunity to meet her. You feel like you know someone when you've been able to read their writings, understand their traumas, where they have come from and their successes, and says, I've learned that I still have a lot to learn.
That's right.
Right. And so we have
That's
an
right.
opportunity to continue to learn. It's a lifelong learning process. So please spend some more time with that timeline. Spend some more time, if you're connected to family, digging into whatever history that you have, maybe the privilege to access, because again, a lot of history has been bombed and burned. And right, sometimes we have to hear our histories through storytelling. I said in my small group, you know, in the African culture, you have the griots, and they're your storytellers in the communities, your elders, if you will. We actually have a council of elders here. And when I feel like I'm out of pocket or if I need some advice, I go to my elders and let them tell me and share with me, hey, what's the precedent here? What have we done in the past? What worked? What didn't work? Who should I watch out for? Right? So take some time to think about your own personal history. Understand your local history, what happened in your own communities, and learn those histories from the vantage point of those that were affected by it, right? Because there's also a run on the market on your history books.
Yeah.
Right. Who writes them and who sells them, and they get to choose what goes in them. And in some states, they're crossing out things and saying, oh, those folks were enslaved. They just needed work. Right. Some of those stories are changing. Those narratives are changing. Right.
Yes.
Colored people weren't just Black people.
Mm.
Right. And being classism is real in our community too. Right. Lower socioeconomic status of any race and ethnicity. Something to that story entail too. So make sure that you're taking the time to understand it, questioning what you learned and how you learned it, and looking to see if it's factual. Any questions for me?
And if you didn't want to take yourself off mute, you could always put it in the chat if you had a question for Danielle.
Great. Well,
I got a good question, please, Danielle.
Yeah.
And Tracy. Hi, Tracy.
Hi, Fran.
Did you email some of this literature to us? Because I never received anything from you except, you know, that you're having a meeting today. I've got some, because I think Tracy answered my question the other day, because that's the only thing I got, and then I got this today.
You know what, Fran? I think I remember you have two different emails. So let me check on those emails, because one is your AOL and then there's another one. So let me check on
yeah.
which
But
one
go to my AOL one.
Yeah, the Francis Choice. Yeah. I'll
yes,
make sure I send that out to you. I sure
okay,
will.
Great. Keep
and
me
I think
abreast.
I think Christina also had herself off mute. And Bernadette, okay.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank you. And you know, I'm glad that I joined this series, because what Danielle just said in regards, be aware of, you know, who's writing those books and what they're saying. It's what I shared with the group on the last breakout room, that, you know, when I came to the US and I took my first history class, I started to question, okay, should we really celebrate Columbus Day or should we not? So going back to what I was taught in Nicaragua, it was like, okay, everything was great. We should be, you know, thankful because of this and the other. And then coming here, it was like I'm glad, because, you know, I was able to open my eyes and, you know, I started to question those events that we were taught in school, you know, in one way, but, you know, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bernadette? A lot of stuff that they don't teach in the schools anymore. They're taking them out, like Columbus Day. A lot of the important days that children should be aware of, they're taking them out of the curriculum. And I to me, that's wrong, because that's part of life and it's part of them growing up, so they can understand themselves. Anyway.
Well, I mean, part of the problem with that is even if they keep them in the history books, they're not telling the whole history. So more than the bigger issue is that the whole history isn't being told, right? So the question that I had is that, so something that came up for me as we were talking in our group is that as we're learning these histories and we're learning about these things that just were harmful to people, harmful to their communities, and we see the impact even today of these historical things, and then we're benefiting, right? So like, what are your ideas? What are your thoughts? How do you handle holding both, right? Like, I think about, one of the things that came up is I live in California. I love living in California, and it's stolen land, you know? So it's like, knowing it's stolen land, knowing that history, and enjoying being here, you know, just, I guess if someone can speak to just how you hold both.
Yeah. You know, and that's a part of this, right? It's knowing and honoring, right? And understanding this is the history. How can I honor something I don't know?
Yeah.
So taking the time to even lean into that education. And then when you understand and know, if you have the capability and the time, showing up to the appropriate spaces to speak about that. How do we center our communities? You know, gentrification happens across the country. So how are we educating our communities to show up and speak up in your city councils and your county commission meetings? How are you connected to your legislature? How are we engaging folks to run in these seats? Because it's not enough to vote anymore. How are we prepared to run and be reflective of the communities that we serve? How do we start to get into those power places and spaces to create change? So there's some of that. How do we engage and tell our folks, don't just leave our communities, come back and buy back the land? Land banks, land trusts.
That's right.
Community agreements, community benefit agreements that says you can't build your business here until you make sure that 15% of the folks that you hire come from the 67214 zip code.
Yeah.
Right. So there's some policy, political things that can happen in our communities. At the very basic level, it's understanding what's going on. At the ground level, understanding that, okay, I bought this beautiful flat, but something else used to be here prior to that. And then if you want to take it all the way to steps, what does reparations look like in your communities? Some folks are into the conversation. Some folks don't want to hear it at all.
Mm-hmm. Can I put a plug in for myself?
You can.
Well, my plug is I am running for Lancaster City Council, and I am running for you, and I am running especially because I am a senior advocate for seniors and for people that can't or are unable to speak for themselves. I speak at city council meetings. I speak at supervisor meetings. I'm a commissioner here in Lancaster, and I'm also a commissioner for LA County. But I wanted to let you know that I hear all these, and this is what I'm taking in, and this is what I am fighting for, is for what we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to add something that what Burnett was addressing in terms of how to address this. I think that it was Carl Jung that said you can't have healing. Healing can't take place until you start calling things by their proper name. So I think identifying and saying, oh, that's an example of marginalization, and I don't consent to that. Being able to name things and also giving credit. I think what you mentioned, Danielle, in even scholarship, if you, I mean, there's a big emphasis on scholastic honesty, giving credit, just acknowledging what happened. I mean, that helps to heal. If somebody acknowledges, yes, this is occupied land.
Yeah.
It doesn't take away the pain, but at least acknowledging it helps in the healing process. If there was some in the Declaration of the Declaration of Independence, if there was some credit given there, this came from the Iroquois nation, because the founding people had no conception of what democracy was about, because they came from, they had kings. And it was through the tribal people that they devised this notion of democracy. If credit is given, I mean, there should be a copyright on the Declaration of Independence saying, you know, you need acknowledgement from tribal people in order to publish this. Do not replicate this unless you have consent from the Iroquois nation. So I think that's when you start acknowledging, and with the Holocaust we learned, And what do they tell you, the survivors? Never forget. Never. It's important to remember our stories. Cuentos, dichos, mitos, the songs, the dances, the ceremonies. Always remember. That's our healing, is remembering. And we need to remember collectively, because this is a collective wound. And tribal tradition tells you when there's a collective wound, you heal collectively. And you don't pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You pick each other up. That's how we rise. That's how we do it.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, right? I'd love to be able to learn from you all too. Or you can't have reconciliation if you don't know what happened. So we can't reconcile something that we don't understand or don't see. So yeah, giving the credit and knowing the background where we come from. We're also seeing more organizations do land acknowledgements. That's another piece of it, acknowledging the land before you open. My only thing is don't just acknowledge it and then turn around and go back to doing the same thing that you've been doing. So be mindful of that as well. Tracy, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, so I know we've gone a little bit over, but if we could just take a moment to give Danielle Johnson either a virtual clap or a real clap. Thank you so much, Danielle. And this 400 years timeline has been brought to you by Best Start. Best Start program. We have one of our other regions here today, Rogelio, but Best Start is a First Five LA initiative. And so this is a part of the Best Start program of capacity building. And so if you receive the flyer, you know that Danielle is going to actually be doing several sessions going into August. The sessions include microaggressions, gender equality, LGBTQ inclusion, just a wide range. So if any of those are an interest to you, let me send out the flyer. I'll be sending out the video today as well. And so if those are an interest to you, the link is embedded into the flyer above the Eventbrite. So please sign up. And also Best Start has our convenings, our quarterly convenings. If you're here in the Antelope Valley, we have that. That might be an interest to you of things going on in the AV, data mapping, network mapping, policy. And so all those things might be an interest to you. My colleague Stephanie put the Best Start AV email and then the link tree. And the link tree has a lot of our different Facebooks. You can follow us. And so again, thank you so much for spending your Thursday with us. This was the first of many sessions with Danielle Johnson. And so we really appreciate it. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your interest. And so hope your rest of the week goes well. You have a lovely weekend and hope to see you again at one of our other sessions. So thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, everybody.